In this talk, I'm going to look at one of the most fundamental building blocks of picture making, namely the drawn line. Some indeed might argue that it is the fundamental building block which sets the ground for everything else. But even if this is going too far, all would concede it has a basic role in the mapping out of plans, developing ideas, as well as being one of the most accurate tools for recording the visible world. The line itself might seem at first to be something simple, but it can also be complex and paradoxical. An example of this is this wonderful, simple yet paradoxical drawing by the American artist Saul Steinberg. It shows a man drawing some grand lines with a single line, but at the same time, the line that the man is drawing is also the line with which the man himself is drawn. So in the end, you're not quite sure whether the man is drawing the line or the line is drawing the man. Well, that's a paradox that perhaps I don't want to go into it in more detail at the moment, but we'll come to similar ideas later on in the talk. For the moment, I want to go back to the basics and look at the fundamental structure of what a line is. I'm dividing my talk up into two parts. In the first part, I'll be talking about general features of the line, and then in the second part, I'll be looking at particular lines, lines like straight lines and curved lines. But in the general features, I'm also going to talk about 5 different things. First of all, I'm going to look at the classical tradition of line drawing in the history of Western art, very briefly, I would like to say. And then I'm going to look at definitions of lines, because perhaps, although they seem terribly straightforward, it's worth thinking what exactly defines a line, what makes a line different from any other kind of mark or any other kind of form that one would see. Then I'm going to look at the claim by some artists that lines in nature don't actually exist, and rather negatively look at lines as being something that might get in the way of us understanding the world rather than actually helping us see it more clearly. Um, and then after that, I'm going to look at how lines began to be used in the history of mankind, that is, going right back to the Stone Age. And finally, I'm going to look at something which I think is very interesting, which is the way that a line is something very personal. Each of us, as we make a line, do it in different ways. And this is something that is maybe revealing about us, but it's also something that we have to address when we're using the line, how much we want to make that individually part of what we're doing. So let's begin with the first part, the classical tradition. The image that I'm showing you is the motto of the Distinguished Art Students League of New York, Nulla dies sine linea, or to put it in English, never day without a line. This was a saying of the ancient Greek artist Apelles, and it is one that has been used in the traditional teaching of art ever since. The implication is that a line drawing is at the basis of all art learning, and in fact also as well that drawing itself is at the basis of art. It's something that can be challenged sometimes today, but this is the kind of motto, if you like, under which art schools for many, many centuries used to work. This is a picture of Apelles in his studio demonstrating the qualities of line to adoring students. I would love to show you the work by Apelles himself, but unfortunately none of it survives. And this reminds me of something I've often told people, is that if you're really seeking immortality as an artist, stick to sculpture. Painting's no good because it'll get destroyed eventually. In the case of poor old Apelles, most of his pictures were done in Greece and got destroyed when Greece was invaded by Turks after the fall of the Roman Empire. But according to everybody who writes about Apelles, he was the sort of Michelangelo of the ancient world, this mastering perspective, anatomy, showing realistic painting in a way that it had never been achieved before. And this is why he held such authority. But over and above everything else, it was his devotion to line that really impressed people. This is an illustration of an incident that demonstrates the association between Apelles and line. Unfortunately, no ancient copies of the original picture exist, so I've taken the liberty to do one myself, using a line I suspect that Apelles would not have approved of. Anyway, the story is that Apelles once came to visit one of his fellow artists and found that the artist was not there, but there was a canvas on the artist's easel which hadn't been used, and so he drew a line on it and left. And when the person came back, he looked at this line and said, "My goodness, Apelles must have been here, because nobody else could have driven a line so individual and so beautiful." That, I think, raises 2 points for me. I think it is the idea that line was the most important form of art, but also that he recognized it as Apelles line, not just because it was beautiful, but because it was characteristically like Apelles, the way Apelles would draw. And those are 2 themes that I'm going to explore later on. This is a view of the Royal Academy's life class from the early 1800s, and it's a reminder of the fact that the idea of using life classes for accurate line drawing of forms was the central plank of academic teaching through the centuries. You'll notice it's also a very male affair. There are all male students studying the figure, and the figure himself is male. It was actually quite difficult for women to get access to this, despite the fact that it was regarded as the most important thing for an artist to master. That last picture might seem rather arid, and so I thought I'd better show you something that gives you more the plus side of that tradition. Here is a marvellous life study by Michelangelo, in which you can see the wonderful clarity of line that is achieved, and also the extraordinarily detailed way in which he's captured the movement and muscles of the body, all very much to do with line and shading and tonality, making it very much an exploration of form. This drawing is also interesting because, as you can see, it was actually used as the basis of one of the figures in Michelangelo's celebrated Sistine ceiling. A couple of points here. One is that whereas the figure is male, the figure that Michelangelo has put on the ceiling is actually female. And that is fairly typical of Michelangelo, which may be partly personal preference, but also, once again, this idea that the male figure somehow demonstrated the clarity of line and form more effectively. As far as I'm concerned, if I had to choose one or the other, I would take the drawing rather than the painting, because it seems so much more alive, so much more sort of about an actual experienced form. But it was the typical idea in classical art, as I think we all know, that you start from a drawing, the drawing maps the thing out, and then you add it on in painting. And it was this attitude that led to the general assumption, once again, that drawing was at the basis of all art, something that you can see very much in the saying of the French president of the Academy in the 19th century, Ingres, well drawn is well enough painted. Ingres you may know as somebody who was a kind of bête noire of the Impressionists, because he seemed to represent everything in art that they were trying to throw over. But he himself was also a very fine draftsman, as you may get from this self-portrait. But he did, as I say, feel he had to maintain the standards of the Academy against all these dreadful modern artists who were trying to tear it down. And his devotion to drawing, once again, was at the centre of his mission. However, I don't want to leave you with the idea that this veneration of line is simply a Western tradition, something to do with the Western academic practice. Because actually, when you go elsewhere in the world, and particularly into Asia, you see a similar veneration of line. I'm demonstrating this to you visually by that wonderful, perhaps the most wonderful line ever drawn, the line that was used by Hokusai, the great Japanese printmaker, in his representation of Mount Fuji. And in many writings of the time, you will find both Chinese and Japanese artists talking about line as the soul of art, where the main ethos and feeling of pictures begins. So what is a line? I'm going to look now at a few definitions that might help us understand it a bit better. One of the earliest definitions of what a line is provided for us by a scientist, that is the mathematician Euclid. Many of us perhaps have rather mixed feelings about Euclid, as we've probably had to struggle with his descriptions of geometrical forms when we were school children. But despite that, perhaps we have to overcome any feelings of that, because he does give very precise and succinct descriptions. The definition that he gave it in his book on geometry is breadthless length, a paradoxical sounding definition, which implies that it is only something that moves in one direction, and that, as its length is what its characteristic is, its width is really not important in defining exactly what it is. This may not seem like a totally satisfactory definition from the artist, for as this sample of lines shows, width is important for character and emphasis when we draw lines. A thin line has a totally different effect to a thick one. It is also possible to have lines that are interrupted or are a sequence of variegated motifs. But taking this all into account, we can still conclude in the end that what makes a line, as opposed to any other form, is its length, and this length must be much greater than its width. How much longer is perhaps a subjective matter, but I think we could all agree that the line that I've drawn at A in this slide is very much longer than it is wide, and we'd have no problem in identifying it as being a line. I think we'd probably also mostly agree that the form that I've put now at D at the bottom of the slide is a rectangle rather than a line. What about the form I've drawn now at B? I think we'd probably most agree that this was best described as a thick line. Well, maybe ultimately it's a subjective matter about how thick a line has to be before it stops becoming a line and becomes a rectangle. But one thing I think we could all agree is that the line has to be very much longer than it is wide. And there's something else that I think comes out of this, which is whereas the width has to be limited, the length has to be unlimited. There is no limit to what a line should be. And that, I think, gives the curious duality to the line, which is perhaps one of its most important features and what I want to look at next. Because viewed from the sideways, the line can be seen as a limit, something that divides two areas, if you like. But viewed at the end, it is an agent of discovery. Something goes on for as long as you would like it to. From this point of view, it's worth remembering that the term drawing the line, which I've been using here to literally mean drawing a line, also has a second meaning, which means setting a limit. This is the way that it's usually used in politics. And in politics, one often hears of lines being drawn which can't be transgressed. And certainly in history, you can see many lines that have been set out to set up boundaries and things like that. Here's an example of an ancient line, Hadrian's Wall, the line that runs across the north of England to set up the difference between the Roman Empire and the barbarians who were below. And here's another political line which had great significance for black Americans in the 19th century. This line, the Mason-Dixon line, marks the distinction between the southern states of the United States, which allowed slavery, and the northern ones in which it was outlawed. If you were a black slave and you crossed the Mason-Dixon line, then you could gain your liberty. In the visual arts, the line that we draw, which is a limit, is the one that makes a distinction between the object that we're drawing and the space around it. In this case, this is taken from a manual of how to draw a head, in which you can see the line gradually limits the head from everything else that is around it. And I'd like to take as a guide here one of my favourite artists, the Swiss-German Paul Klee, and an artist who's full of exploration and discovery in his work, and he certainly brought that to his understanding of the line. And he made this wonderful statement that a line is simply a dot going for a walk. Paul Klee taught at the revolutionary German art institution, the Bauhaus, and it was in this context that he talked about the line and that he encouraged students to explore with the line in the way that he did. Here are some notes from his sketchbooks which he used to help him with his teaching. And you can see here how he demonstrates the line going for a walk in this wonderful curving way. And then he has another image underneath, but always rather like, which is the line going for a walk with a little one accompanying it. I always think that's a little bit like taking a dog for a walk with you. Some artists have taken this exploration to the form of creating a kind of technical game. This is an example by Picasso, for example, when he did an illustration for Igor Stravinsky's piece of music, Ragtime. Perhaps it was the jazzy nature of this work that made him want to do something rather quirky and amusing himself. And what he's done here is that he's done a drawing in which he's done the whole drawing with one line, not taking it off the page all the way through. Quite a virtuoso performance, though also in some ways one might say it's limited to a technical exercise. Great as an idea, and of course lots of people develop from this kind of thing to do all sorts of amazing doodles. But I don't want this to take away from the fact that the wider idea of Linus exploration, covers quite a lot more things than this. And indeed, in traditional art, the twisting, turning line has long been used as a kind of exploration of a spirituality, almost like a spiritual exercise, as in this Celtic manuscript, in which you can see the line, I'm not sure if it's just one line, I can't actually work out where one would begin and one would end, but the idea of the line entwining and twisting round itself gives a sense of multiplicity and the grandeur of creation, all centered around a cross, which is another interesting point because this is a piece of Celtic art, but it's a piece of Christian Celtic art in which they tried to celebrate Christianity with their wonderful traditional use of exploiting twisty, curly lines. And this emphasizes the endlessness, the inexhaustibility of the line. The question, how long is a line, has the same answer as the answer to the question, how long is a piece of string? The answer being, it's as long as you like. You can spend as much time as you like imagining incredibly long lines. So how is it that I can see Betelgeuse? The reason is because there is an amount of light, a little parcel of light, that left Betelgeuse many, many hundreds of years ago and has travelled in a line throughout space and has miraculously ended up in my eye. And that has created the possibility of me seeing Betelgeuse because the light that comes from Betelgeuse has made me aware that it is there. The answer is 700 light years. That means that that parcel of light has been travelling for 700 years. That is, it must have started out about the time of the Battle of Agincourt in the 15th century to end up in my eye. A light year is the space that is the space that a parcel of light travels in 1 year, which is approximately 6 trillion miles. So it's 700 times 6 trillion miles that tells you how far it is. I'll leave you to do the maths, but it's something like about 45 trillion miles, I think. That's a pretty long line. And the only thing that's extraordinary about that is the line could be many times longer than that if you really wanted, because they can go on forever. Well, after that flight of fancy, perhaps it's time to come down to earth. It's certainly true that there was a parcel of light that left Betelgeuse 700 years ago and ended up in my eye just last night when I looked at it. But you could argue at the same time that although those facts are true, the line that connects them is something that's purely in my own mind. And some people would argue that lines are simply a matter of personal imagination, something that humans construct and project onto the world rather than things that are ever there. And that is certainly the view of many artists in the 19th century. So I'm going to move on now to the quote of Edward Manet, that wonderful artist connected with Impressionism, who said very firmly that there are no lines in nature. Manet added to this statement, there are only areas of colour, one against another. This did indeed become the practice amongst the Impressionist painters, perhaps above all in the wonderful nature studies of Monet, such as these grain stacks. And indeed it has led to a whole different way of looking at painting, which has been very important in modern art altogether. Though I think one should also add that while this is true, and while certain types of painting have certainly benefited great by this perception, nevertheless the line still is used in many other kinds of art. The question of whether lines really exist in nature or not can be eternally debated, but I think one thing we all do grasp is that whether there are some lines in nature or not, there are certainly many places where we see lines when in fact they aren't really there. And we also tend to use lines perhaps at times when we know they're not there. For example, I've just a random example. Supposing one was drawing this jar, the drawing is on the left-hand side. When you look at the jar, it might look as though not only has it got a very well-defined top and all the rest of it, but the two sides of it have clear dark lines, as has been put in the drawing itself. But if you look at a plan of the glass, as I've added on the right-hand side, you can see that actually what we think of as lines is nothing more than the glass simply curving away from us. There are no actual lines on that glass. It is just a curved object, and where we see the curve turn away from us, we see that as a line. Drawing lines may be largely a matter of the human imagination, but I think it's interesting to see that it is something that goes back very much to the origins of our species. I always think that the scratches that you find in prehistoric sites is perhaps the place where it begins, and so I'm now going to have a look at those in a bit more detail. I've got on the screen what is at the moment, I think, thought of as being one of the various earliest of such marks. You can see these sort of straight lines that have been made together. Clearly you can see that there's an attempt there to actually construct something, to make them join up, and also they're very straight. I think another thing that is interesting to see is that they're sort of downward movements. You can imagine them being made by just striking a stone or some other subject with your a flint stone in your hand, or even a stick or something like that. There would be quite a natural downwards movement of the arm with the hand to do that. Here is the object on which those marks were made. It's a mussel shell that was found in a sediment, I think somewhere in North Africa, which is dated to about 500 BC, which is incredibly right at the beginning of the time that Homo sapiens is supposed to have come into being. In fact, it might even be by a Neanderthal rather than a Homo sapiens itself. Here is a somewhat later example from the Blombos caves in South Africa, about 70,000 BC. You can see, I think, by this time that the patterns are getting more elaborate. I also think it's interesting to see at this time there doesn't seem to be any interest in using these lines to represent recognizable objects. It's more an interest in the patterning itself, which is where the beginning of lines seems to begin. 30,000 years later or more, the situation seems to be rather different. Here in these wonderful cave paintings from Lascaux in France, one sees not only has the line become used in a more flexible way, no longer just making straight strokes, but also that they've found out how to use line to actually describe objects. In this case, a wonderful auk or something like that, possibly an animal that was being hunted, and with a degree of naturalism that perhaps we ourselves can envy. It is quite remarkable to think that at this time, 15,000 BC or 30,000, people have different views, human beings are still living in huts. Well, not even in huts, mostly they're still in caves. They haven't got a wheel. They don't know how to use metal. They've got very primitive means, but they have got flintstones, of course, and they can sharpen sticks. But even at that point, they've learned how to do representation in art. They've also learned, I think, by the fact that this is a drawn rather than scratched object, to how to use materials that will stick so that you can do painting or drawing like you would with a brush. So this shows a considerable advance, and also probably a considerable advance in imagination. I now want to move on to the last general point I wanted to make about the line, and that is the line as an expression of individuality. I've already made it clear that I feel that line is something that comes out of a natural human gesture, a natural way in which we use our hands. And of course, we're all different in that, and we all do it in different ways. And I think this idea about the line being something that has individual character is probably brought out in that idea of the expression, what's my line? Um, If you're as old as me, you might remember that panel game from the 1950s, What's My Line, where people had to guess what the profession of a particular person was who came on, what line it is that they had, that concept of line relating to what you did. It always struck me as interesting that part of the process of identifying the individual was that who was being questioned was that they wrote their signature. And again, I think this is shows us how the signature is seen as our unique identifier, and it is our own personal line, if you like. And there is a belief that each individual writes their signature in a unique manner, which is why we use signatures so often to try and authenticate documents and the like. Whether this is completely true or not, I don't know, but it's certainly the idea of the individuality of line making comes up in the concept of signature, and indeed when artists look, well, sorry, when connoisseurs, I should say, look at art, you might say that idea of signature is in their mind when they often explore the nature of the line of individual artists. I've already mentioned that the lines that we draw are related to our physical bodies as well as to our minds, because when we draw, holding an object in our hands to draw, we find that we can move it in certain ways in relationship to our own bodies. For example, if you draw with your right hand, you'll probably find that it's much easier to make a series of lines going from left up to right on a slant than it is to make them go from left down to right. Because one on the left, you can see that you can move your hand back and forward quite easily. The other one, you have to move it up and down, moving your elbow, and that's more difficult. Of course, one of the skills that one acquires when learning to draw a lot is how to compensate for this. But there is a difference, and to a certain degree, when we use and create our own art, we are making decisions about how much we do or do not compensate for these natural differences in the ways that we make images. And by the same token, you'll find that if you are left-handed, that it's actually easier for to make sloping lines going from the right, from the left down to the right, rather than up to the right, as you do with the right hand, because you're moving a hand that goes in the opposite direction, so that's an easier slope for you. It is this fact that has made it possible for connoisseurs to work out that Leonardo da Vinci was a left-handed artist. Here's a sketch that he made of a head, and you can see the slope of the lines on the right-hand side. That's the kind of slope that you would make if you were quickly wanting to do some shading and not too much worried about other matters. So you might then use what is most natural and easy to you to make that kind of slope. By a similar process, it could be worked out that Raphael was right-handed. Here he is doing a study of a hand in which you can see the natural sloping lines of a right-handed person being evident. Here you can see the two examples together, Leonardo on the left and Raphael on the right. In this second part of the talk, I'm going to look at some specific types of lines because these have developed in different ways and they can be used in very different ways and also have quite different effects. I'll look first of all at the straight line, then I'll look at curved lines, then I'll look at the use of outline in design, and then I'll look at a rather intriguing group, implied lines, in which our imagination plays quite a part in sort of seeing a line when actually there's not one there. And finally, I'll look at multiple lines, which is perhaps more to do with graphic art, because it's the way that we use lines not just to express single movements and ideas, but also to build up concepts of tone and texture, which might not seem to be the simplest way to do it often for a lot of people. I'll start first with the straight line, which is the simplest and most direct form of line, and also in some ways one of the most influential. From the scientific point of view, the straight line is most important because it charts the shortest distance between 2 points. It can also be used expressively to give a sense of firmness and structure, as for example in this painting by Johan Hugo, in which you can see that he's reduced areas like the line of the chin or the nose, or also the windpipe on the neck to a straight or nearly straight line. It was used for similar reasons by the abstract painter Mondrian to give a sense of structure and solidarity to his abstract compositions. These were pictures in which he tried to create a fundamental art language, all made up of rectangular, horizontal and vertical lines and primary colors. Another point about the line that this emphasizes is that it moves in a single direction. The straight line doesn't bend or curve or do U-turns like other lines. It just goes in one direction. And that makes it very useful for a suggestion of powerful direction in a picture. We typically have a very strong sense of direction, particularly a sense of what is up and what is down, and what goes to the left and what goes to the right. And I think it's worth reflecting that there's a particular reason why we have this particular sense of direction built into us, and that is because of the place where we live. We live, as you know, on a circular world, and yet we see it as a flat world. We feel it as flat because of gravity. It is gravity that holds us to the surface of the world. And although if one person if you looked at it from this picture, you would think that, say, if that is England at the top and there is a man standing on it, then that's a man in Australia and he seems to be hanging from the ceiling by his feet. But you know he isn't, because he's just as much on the ground as we are. If gravity wasn't there, we'd simply just fly away from this Earth and we'd be floating in space. And we'd have no sense of up or down. That is an experience that you learn about from people who travel into space. The sense of up and down doesn't exist anymore from us. But for us it does, and it has an important point because it means that things that are vertical seem very solid and straight because they are at right angles to the Earth and having an equilibrium with it. Things that are horizontal seem to be lying down because they've, so to speak, attached themselves along the side of the Earth. And things at an angle are more problematic because they could either be seen as dynamically moving away from Earth or else gradually conceding to them. Here's an example of using a diagonal, a straight line diagonal, in a dynamic way to suggest movement and advance. It's by one of the Italian futurist artists who, as you know, very much wanted to have an art that celebrated the power of modernity. In this one, which I think must be related to the First World War because it's called Attack of the Lancers, you can see this dynamic effect being produced by the sloping straight line. In this deposition by Michelangelo, you can see the sloping diagonal line being used in the opposite direction for going downwards as the figure of Christ is lowered from the cross. Now I'll go on to the curved line, which is much more sinuous and multi-directional and has many more different and some complex effects. This is just an example of some of the variety of curved lines. There are mathematical ones like the ones on the top right, which are often used in calculation, and then more serpentine ones like the one on the left, and then the one below, which is really a line going for a walk again, a bit like in the case of Paul Klee's works. The curved line is usually associated with ideas of beauty and elegance, as in the case of this work by Botticelli on the left-hand side, showing the three graces, and the picture by Hokusai, the Japanese artist Hokusai, of a lady from Japan. And indeed, the association of the serpentine line with beauty led the English artist William Hogarth to publish a book in the 1750s called The Line of Beauty, or rather it was called The Analysis of Beauty, but he made the serpentine line the centre of his argument. Here's a closer view of the line of beauty on his palette. I'm going to now look at another kind of line that has been much discussed in aesthetics. This is the outline or the boundary line that you can draw around an object. This kind of line was the focus of an innovative study of Greek art by the German art historian Winckelmann, which was published in the late 18th century. Winckelmann promoted Greek art because he felt it possessed a purity that had been lost in the modern world. He talked about its noble simplicity and calm grandeur. For Winckelmann, the clear outline around Greek figures was a sign of this purity and calm simplicity. I think he is probably as much influenced by Greek pots as he was by any paintings he might have seen. The interest in outline was also influenced by the dominance of an ancient Greek myth about the origin of paintings, which Winckelmann knew well. This was the story that painting had begun when a Corinthian maid was bewailing the fact that her lover was about to go off to war, and in order to keep a record of him, she traced the outline of his shadow on a wall. This is the picture. This picture that you see here is one done at the same time as Gil Winkelmann was alive by Joseph Wright, the British artist. Another interesting point about this picture is you can see a fire in the background. That's a potter's kiln, because in fact the Corinthian maid was the daughter of a potter, and the potter made a plaque out of the outline that she'd drawn. So once again you see this association between Greek pots and linear outlines. And indeed, one of the consequences of this fascination with outlines, and indeed the story of the Greek origins of painting, was the vogue for profile outlines based on the shadow of somebody, which began to proliferate in the 18th century. This is the kind of setup that you can see where somebody is sitting with their profile against a screen, and the light is casting a shadow on it, which is being traced by an artist behind. Here is a profile of Jane Austen, what was done in this manner. I think one of the other things one sees about this interest in outline is, although on one level it could be seen as representing the purity of line that you see in Greek art, on the other it is seen as a very accurate way of transcribing the actual physiognomy of an individual, one that was seen particularly in the days prior to photography, as being a much more precise and accurate way of recording features than just an artist drawing what they see in front of them. It's perhaps not surprising that this was also a time when there was a great interest in phonology, where people felt they could read people's characters by the shapes of their head. Anyway, that is a vogue that was very much characteristic in the late 18th and early 19th century and has gone out of fashion since. And perhaps the interest in outline these days, a pure outline, is much less than it was in those days, though there still are examples of artists exploring and using it up to this time. In the 1920s, Picasso did his own take on this outline vogue in this marvelous portrait of Stravinsky, and I think it shows you how a creative understanding of outline can produce marvelous results. And here, just to bring us a bit further up to date, is a fine outline drawing done by Hockney. The next type of line I'd like to look at is the implied line. That is the line that really isn't there at all, but where our imagination creates it from clues that have been given in the drawing. Another rather amusing example of this is a work by a local artist, Miles Thistlethwaite. A few years ago, Miles had an exhibition called Washing Line Portraits, in which, perhaps rather cheekily, he actually showed people's clothes on washing lines as kind of portraits of them. In this case, this is not quite that. It's actually somebody's towel, I presume, that's hanging on the line. But the point I want to emphasize here is that he's done this and there is no actual washing line drawn. Because it's called Washing Line Portraits and it looks as though it's hanging off a line, you think the line is there when it isn't. Once again, as I say, this is the helping us to understand how much we project line when we see things. We look for lines. We find lines when they are suggested to us, even if they aren't there. It is this willingness to project lines that helps us to understand and see compositions in different pictures. In this photograph, for example, of a lady walking past a series of posts, I think people often see that, or would talk about that in terms of various diagonal lines, even when they're not actually there. It is quite common in discussions of composition to see such lines drawn in order to aid us to understand them. I'm not criticizing this as a practice. I'm just saying, once again, it shows how important the perception of line is in the way that we understand the arrangement and design of pictures. It's something I would say that is deeply ingrained in us and is the way we help ourselves to interpret and understand imagery generally. Perhaps the best known example of this is the use of contours, as you can see on maps, for example, where you will have several lines inside each other indicating changes of height of the terrain that the map is covering. This was an idea that was innovated in the 18th century by the famous Scottish geologist James Hutton, and it has become a feature in all our maps. And I think the interesting point is here is although it is as used in a map a technical thing, it simply says this is where 100 feet is, this is where 150 feet is, this is where 200 feet is, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, grouped together, they actually form a kind of image. So that in this case, you can see these contours are mapping what is a rudimentary hill, a bit like Glastonbury Tor, but with steps on it, and how it is not only giving you the way of understanding that in a third dimension, but it also is giving you, as you look at it, a visual image that you can translate as to you can imagine just by looking at it what it might be. However, while contour maps only came into being in the 18th century, artists before that had long understood the way in which they could use lines drawn on a form in order to indicate its shape and dimensions. This is a rather charming example, I think, by the French early 18th century artist Watteau, but he was doing a sketch of a woman who was wearing a dress, perhaps silk or satin, I don't know, which had lines in its design, and he's used those lines, as you see, to articulate the whole of her body and the beautiful folds of the textures themselves. It's a very fine example, I think, of that use of contouring in lines. Playing with contour drawing can also produce remarkable effects in doodling. This is, I think, quite a virtuoso example of somebody who's just taking a group of parallel lines and using them much as one would in a map, but in this case to create a wonderful abstract design, which is a bit like a piece of unfolding fabric. In the case of contour drawing, one is still aware of the fact that individual lines are constructing the visual form that you're looking at. To end this section, I want to look at multiple lines in disguise. That is when they're used at a much more sort of micro level, and this is one of the principal ways in which graphic artists use it to represent things like textures and tones, which aren't drawing attention particularly to the fact that they're made of lines, just they want to give the effect that you could get with other processes, such as charcoal or paint, but in this case you're just doing it with lines. This way of handling line is one of the principal activities of traditional graphic artists and has been for several hundred years. And I think the reason why it came into being so much is because of the innovation of printing and the printing press in the 15th century. Well, why do I say that? Well, I will explain. Printing, as you know, is what came in as a process of producing multiple publications in late 15th century, and it was a way in which, for the first time, books could be mass-produced. But it was very much dependent in its early days on simply being able to handle pure black and white. The letterpress that was printed was simply one colour against the colour of the paper. it didn't have any facilities for any tonalities or indeed for multiple colors or anything like that. And it wasn't for a very, very long time, not until really the early 20th century, that it actually became economically viable to do a lot of printing in color. And it wasn't really even until our own times, with the coming of digital printing, that there really became no difference between the cost of black and white printing, monochrome printing, and color printing. In those circumstances, there was a necessity to find images which would translate and could be read in pure black and white. Now, the way of doing that for a graphic artist was to use multiple lines in order to create senses of tonality and texture, which otherwise could have been used by different methods. I've got a picture here of an early printing press. You can see them all at hand. And they had to have something that would enable images to go into the book very much in the same way as the letterpress was done, again for economic reasons. So again, the blocks for images that had to be produced had to be reproducible in exactly the same way as letterpress was. Nobody demonstrated the ability of line to achieve such effects in the early days better than that great German artist Albrecht Dürer. Here is one of his woodcuts, and you can see even from this the extraordinary amount of tonal effect and detail that he's able to bring into a cutting of what before had been quite a crude wood cutting process. And certainly Dürer's ingenuity in thinking the way around the problem, if you like, is really quite staggering. The high point of this technical development took place in the 19th century when black and white prints on wood were used for mass reproduction in the newspapers and journals. Here is a marvelous example from the French artist Gustave Doré's London, A Pilgrimage, published in 1872. And it seems extraordinary to think, looking at that, that is all completely done in line. That is done as wood engraving rather than wood block, which is a finer wood. You can get finer details on the wood engraving than you can on the wood block. But even so, the idea that this is done completely in terms of line is really quite remarkable. Well, this technical virtuosity reached its heights in the 19th century, and one of the reasons why it didn't develop beyond this, because this is the point when photogravure comes in. In other words, when you start to find that it's possible to photographically reproduce and print drawings and paintings, and actually turn your photograph, turn these into actual printing blocks, so you could go straight from the photograph to the printing press, and you no longer needed this technical virtuosity that the wood engravers of the 19th century had developed. And I think we ought to bear in mind that when I say it's by Gustave Doré, Gustave Doré was the artist who did the drawings, but it was many nameless wood engravers who worked in almost factory conditions in the printing press of days that actually did this extraordinary virtuoso cutting. But while this extraordinary virtuoso kind of wood engraving fell out of general practice in the late 19th century, nevertheless there were artists who continued to use the effects of multiple lines used in this way in their pictures just for the effect itself. And I think a good example of this from the same period is this wonderful etching by Samuel Palmer called The Lonely Tower, which was published in 1879, just a few years after the Doré work. In this, of course, Palmer is envisaging a night scene. It's based on Milton's poem Il Penseroso, and it's all about the lonely, melancholic philosopher in his lonely tower contemplating the night sky. So it's very much a nocturnal picture, and he's brought this out. You can see the sickle moon indicating that it's actually just the beginning of the morning that's coming, and this wonderful effect of that sort of ambient light, which is all being done again with line. This picture is one of the famous etchings by Palmer that impressed a lot of people. One great admirer of this picture was William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet, who referred to it as an image of mysterious wisdom won by toil. And I think this idea of mysterious wisdom won by toil is one that captured Palmer's imagination and why he wanted to work so hard at doing the whole thing very meticulously with all these tiny lines to create these very, very subtle effects of low light. Here is a detail of the section of the etching round by the tower, in which you can get an idea of the extraordinary myriad of lines that has been created here to give those different tonal effects, and thinking of how carefully he has actually nuanced the differences between the different areas. I think it's quite interesting that one of the reviewers of these etchings said, why on earth is Palmer still going on doing all these lines to give tones when nowadays it'd be quite easy to do the whole thing in mezzotint. You could just do it, very, very quickly with a new tonal effect and get much the same effect. And Palmer said, no, that's completely wrong. I want it to look like that. I want you to get the sense of all those myriad lines, and then the stars peeping out between them. I want that effect. And I think he did want it because it almost had a kind of mystical concept, the concept of the manifold. It gave you that sense of the sky was manifold, full of an infinite variety of things, and that sense of infinity being brought together by this myriad of lines is the kind of concept of wonder that Palmer hoped to get into his images and Palmer's interest in this sense of the multiplicity in his etchings puts one in mind to some extent of those ideas of multiplicity in line that one found in those early Celtic manuscripts, which I discussed earlier on. Well, now I've come to the end of my talk, in which I've discussed lines of all kinds of shapes and sizes and in all kinds of situations. I could have discussed more, but I hope to have done enough to demonstrate the possibilities. To end this talk, I'd prefer to end rather differently by coming back to the single line, for that is the heart of the matter. And what better line to look at than that famous one by Hokusai in one of his prints of Mount Fuji. This shows, I hope, how beautiful a single line can be, and also gives you the idea of the line's principal function as giving a guide to the eye, to take the eye on a journey. And so it's with the thought of that journey that I'll end the journey of this lecture.